Good morning. My name is Renee, and I wanted to give my testimony today. I hope everyone's doing well. I am 49 years old. I live outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and I have 4 adult children. I'm a widow. But my story starts when I was younger. First of all, I grew up in a Pentecostal church. My grandfather was the pastor, so that's all I ever knew. I grew up under the pews of the church, basically. I served in church starting when I was, 10 years old, playing the piano, and then teaching Sunday school when I was 12 or 13. And so that's really all I've known is, being in church and growing up. And it was a very strict background. So I grew up sheltered. I grew up not getting to go do things that my friends were doing, like ball games and concerts and things like that, because it was a strict church. And so when I was 15, I decided I had fallen in love with this older guy that came around. Well, first of all, you have to know I'm from Eastern Kentucky. So that kind of gives a background, as far as I lived in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, and first of all, it was not uncommon to get married young and things like that. So I fell in love with this guy when I was 15. He was 7 years older than me. And I guess my parents thought that I might run off and get married, or I don't really know exactly, but they agreed. They let me. We dated, and they ended up letting me get married to him. I was barely 16 when we got married. There was a few red flags before we got married, but I was too young and naive to really pay attention to red flags, or really to pay attention to any advice, which I didn't really get a lot of advice as far as not marrying him. But after we got married, within a couple months, I started to experience another side of him. He had promised my parents that I could stay in school, and that was good for the first month. And then he started getting really jealous, asking me every person I talked to during the day while I was going to school and all that good stuff. Again, being that young, I just thought, hey, he really loves me. He's, it's okay that he's jealous. He just wants me to himself. He's just taking care of me. All the things that we typically tell ourselves. So after a few months, I felt enough pressure from him that I dropped out of school. I would have probably graduated, I don't know, 3rd or 4th highest in my class had I stayed there. And after I quit school, and the red flags became more prevalent, I guess. And again, I didn't see them. I didn't pay attention to them. But after a couple months, he hit me the first time. Of course, typical abuser situation. They apologize. It'll never happen again. I'm sorry. They buy you gifts. All the typical stuff that I know now. Of course, I didn't know then. Like I said, I grew up very sheltered. Had never experienced anyone I take that back. I had experienced a Sunday school teacher that had been involved with a physical abusive situation. But anyway, as time progressed, he kept hitting me, would beat me, kick me, slap me. I'd have bruises all the time, and I became a good liar. I lied to my family. I didn't have really many friends because he was very controlling over who I talked to. If I went to town, as we call it, going to town to go get groceries or whatever, he clocked my miles. He would watch, he would he knew exactly how many miles it took to go get groceries and all that stuff. So anyway, as the time progressed, 2 years went by, and I didn't know any better. I didn't know that I could leave. I didn't know that that was an option for me. You got married and you stayed married. Divorce was evil, and you just didn't do that. Well, after a couple of years of putting up with it, by this time I had turned 18, and I woke up one day realizing that I hated him, and that whatever love that I felt for him was replaced with hate. And I began to think of ways that I could retaliate, or ways that I could get out, I guess. When I realized that my hatred could cause me to do something that I didn't want to do, then I said, I've got to leave. And so at 18, I left him a note one day, and I said, this is it. I'm tired of being your punching bag. I'm leaving. And it was very hard. He stalked me for about 4 or 5 months, 6 months. I had to have family watching out for me. I had to let my parents know where I was going to be and things like that, because by this time they had found out the truth after I'd lied to them all these years. So that being said, and that's a really rough condensed version, but fast forward to my parents decided, my dad had got hurt in the coal mines, and so they decided to move to North Carolina. And they were going to college. They both had enrolled in college, and so I decided to go to college too. I had gotten my GED and everything, so got to college, was out on my own with, living with a roommate, going to college, working 2 jobs, and that lasted for a couple months. And I decided I wanted to, be closer to my folks, because they, in the meantime, decided to move to North Carolina. So we moved to North Carolina, and fast forward, they moved to North Carolina, and then I moved down with them shortly after. And then it wasn't too long after that, the divorce was final in 88, that fall. And it wasn't too long after we moved to North Carolina in 89 that I met somebody else. And he had just got born again. He was on fire for God. He really had a calling on his life and everything. And so he pursued me, and we started dating. And in 1990, I was married to Curtis. And so things were good, but I had carried all of my baggage from the first marriage into the second marriage. He had a lot of baggage. He had a lot of anger issues that I weren't totally aware of before we dated. We only dated about maybe 4 or 5 months, 6 months before, 5 months before we got married, which I don't advise. But anyway, we got married, and it wasn't too long after that I started seeing anger and rage in him. And of course that brought back a lot that I had tried to push under the rug from my first marriage. And so in 91 we had our first daughter, and he was like Jekyll and Hyde. When he was out about in church, people just thought he was the most awesome man of God there ever was. And he was really smart in the ways of God. He was really well versed. He knew a lot about the Bible and everything. But nobody knew what we went through with at home because of his anger and because of his moods and his instability and everything. So he never physically hurt me. It was more emotional and mental abuse. Later we found out he had a mood disorder and everything. But through those years, we have 4 children, and through those years the kids would find themselves on the brunt end of his anger. He would discipline them very harshly. I couldn't say anything about about his discipline or anything. I would have to just kind of bite my tongue. And looking back now, sometimes I think I was a coward, but I really did what I thought I could do at that time. I mean, I was afraid of him, yeah. And so time just kept marching on and everything. And, I just dealt with it over the years. I didn't, I had family and friends that saw, his abuse and saw some of what, I would go through. Not anything near what, we would go through behind closed doors. But they would say, why don't you leave? And I wanted to leave. I tried to leave. And at one point, in 2004, we decided to move to Florida away from all of our family, my church and everything. And we moved to Florida for a couple of years. And those were the most difficult 2 years I think I've ever experienced. That we fought all the time. He was so angry. He was just... But on the other side, when he was at church, he was well respected because people didn't know the other side of him. And he would, he was very prophetic. He knew how to expound on the Word of God. It was just amazing, his knowledge of the Word. But yet he never was able to get a hold of the fact that he had some major issues and some problems. And of course I had issues because I didn't know how to communicate and how to talk to him about these things. If I did try to talk to him, it was always my fault. It was always me. I was always the one pushing his buttons. And if I would learn how to not push his buttons, everything would be okay. So in 2006, we decided, he had a mild heart attack in Florida. And at that point, we decided to move back to North Carolina. My family helped us move back. And so shortly after we moved back, we discovered he had melanoma. He had a mole that was stage 4 melanoma. So they removed a big, huge chunk out of his shoulder, did a bunch of surgeries and stuff, and basically declared him cancer-free. And so in the meantime, I had gotten my old job back in North Carolina, and, things seemed to be going a little bit better. He actually had to file for disability because he had neuropathy real bad, and we had discovered that he was diabetic. He had severe sleep apnea. He had a lot of health problems that started just crashing in on him. But yet they said he was cancer-free. So, fast forward to, I don't know, I guess, in 2009, they discovered a place on his lung. And that, they said, we'll just watch it. And so they watched it 6 months. There was no change. And then 6 months later, there was a change. It had grown. So in 2010, they put him in, he had a section of his lung removed, and we found out that the melanoma had spread, had metastasized to his lungs. That was in June of 2010. By September, it had already spread to his brain, his spinal cord, it was just like a wildfire. During that time, of the second time of him having cancer, he began to, because he was approved for disability, and he had to go through some mental testing during the process of getting disability, and it was discovered then that he did have a mood disorder. He had OCD, he had was bipolar. And so he started on some medications, and we started seeing some changes. And especially the second time around when he had the cancer, God just started opening his eyes, and he started really seeing the damage that he had caused. By this time, our kids were teenagers. The youngest was 10. And he, the worse he got with the cancer, he decided that he needed to make things right. So he came to us, and he talked to us, and he apologized, and he asked us to forgive him for all the damage that he had done over the last 20 years. And because of that, my kids were able to face his death knowing he was man enough to admit what he had done, and that he apologized, and he, you know, wanted things to be different. Well, he lost his battle to cancer in January of 2011, and since then it's just been 8 years of healing. I tell people it's hard to heal from the death of a spouse, definitely. But when you combine that with having to heal from the abuse and the things that had piled up, the things I hadn't dealt with my first marriage, and then the things all through my 20-year marriage to him, it's taken 8 years of healing. And I feel like God has got me in a place now where he's ready to do some more things in me and work through me. I'm single. I don't date. I've dated one guy for a short period of time last year, but right now that's where God has me, and focused on him and focused on my healing and moving forward with him. I know this is lengthy, and I thought about breaking this up into two videos, but this is the short condensed version of it. But I love you guys, and it's just a privilege to be on this group, and I hope all of you all have a blessed day. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.